And now let's turn to the reason you're all here today, our important and timely program, Civil Liberties in China, the Uyghur Crisis, and to our distinguished panel. It gives me great pleasure to briefly introduce our panel, and you can find longer bios online. To my far right, Nuri Turkle is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He specializes in national security, foreign policy, digital authoritarianism, and issues of forced labor and supply chain risk. Nuri's expertise also includes global justice enforcement, human rights and religious freedom in China, and the prevention of atrocities, including genocide. He is a commissioner to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. In September of 2020, he was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. And in May 2021, he was named on Fortune's list of the world's 50 greatest leaders. To his left, Sean Roberts is the director of the International Development Studies and May program at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. His regional expertise is in Central Asia, and he has done extensive research on the Uyghur people in the People's Republic of China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, as well as in Central Asia and Turkey. His most recent book is titled The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority. And online, we have Rushan Abbas, who is the founder and executive director of the Campaign for Uyghurs, which she established in 2017 to advocate for the human rights and democratic freedoms of Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples oppressed by the Chinese government. She has been an activist since her days at university in East Turkestan, where she was a co-leader and pro-democracy and leader of the pro-democracy protests. In 2018, her own sister was abducted by the Chinese government and illegally sentenced to prison in retaliation for Rushan's activism. Today, Rushan continues to advocate for her release and for the freedom of millions of other Uyghurs. To my immediate left, last but certainly not least, we have Sophie Richardson. She is our moderator for today, and she serves as the China Director at Human Rights Watch, where she has overseen the organization's research and advocacy on China since 2006. She has published extensively on human rights and political reform in the country and across Southeast Asia. She is the author of China, Cambodia, and the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, an in-depth examination of China's foreign policy since the 1954 Geneva Conference. Thanks so much to all 4 of you for joining us today. And Sophie, the floor is yours to begin our conversation.
Great. Terrific. First, let me make sure that everybody can actually hear me. It is a little bit of a challenge to speak through a mask. Is the volume okay? Great, terrific. Well, first of all, thank you very much to LaShawn and to Perry World House for having us this afternoon for an actual in-person conversation. This in and of itself is very exciting, but we promise we won't forget those of you who are calling in online. And I just want to reassure you that when I pick up my phone, it is not to check to see if my child has done his chemistry homework, but rather to check the questions that are coming to me on WhatsApp so that we can have a good discussion. But we thought that it would probably be most effective, especially because we finally have people in a room, to have a real conversation between the 3 or 4 of us as we get started trying to surface some of the main issues about what's happening to the Uyghur community and why, before we bring in the audience for questions. So feel free to start thinking of those. I think the only request that I have of people is to understand that what's happening to Uyghurs and Kazakhs and Kyrgyz across the Uyghur region is real. It's a nightmare and it's ongoing. And in that sense, you know, our friends who are here with us this afternoon are experiencing this very personally, and it's very painful. This is not some abstract problem that's happening to people far away. It's very real. And I'm grateful to Nuri and Sean and Rushan for all they've taught me over the years. Rushan, I wish you were here with us. I'm going to put the first question to you by asking you simply to describe the current situation for Uyghurs in that region. You've disappeared. There you are. I want to make sure you could hear that question, but please go ahead. We'll start with you.
Thank you, Sophie. It's about 11 p.m. here. I'm in Istanbul joining you for this panel. And thank you so much for the University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House for hosting this program. And it's my honor to join with such esteemed colleagues here. I am incredibly appreciative of the dedication to sharing the truth on the Uyghur genocide. At present, the situation is very precarious, as Sophie just mentioned. It's worse than anybody can imagine, actually. The millions of Uyghurs remain languishing in the concentration camps, prisons, and the factories to be used as slaves. And we continue to hear that phrase, cooperation regarding the authorities responsible for these atrocities. Imagine how that word resonates to those who are imprisoned and facing torture, sexual abuse, and the death. And imagine how that word comes across to the people sitting before you today, like Nuri, like myself, who have confronted the crimes of the Chinese regime at the great risk and the cost. As Sophie mentioned, for myself, this cost has been my own sister's freedom. As Uyghurs, we do not even have the freedom to make decisions for ourselves outside of China, because our use of democratic freedoms can be used, and the so-called justification to punish our families. My sister disappeared in September 2018, and her disappearance came 6 days after I participated on a panel just like this one at the Hudson Institute. And Sean Roberts was also on the panel that day. I addressed the genocidal crimes of the Chinese regime and the disappearance of my husband's entire family into the concentration camps. Then the Chinese government retaliated by taking my own sister, a retired medical doctor. Since then, I have had absolutely no news and cannot even be sure that if she's still alive. The Chinese state initially accused me of making up a missing relative and saying that I was stealing other people's photos. And then later, confirming a prison sentence on the sham charges. My nieces are living in a daily torment, having their innocent mother torn from them. China is not only getting away with such active genocide, but getting rewarded when you look at it, the massive businesses from the West, while the Uyghurs are working as slaves and also hosting the Olympic Games. And we have the privilege of academic discourse here in the United States, yet even this is not guaranteed as universities' acceptance of foreign tuition funds has caused a frightening amount of self-censorship. And Western academics like Jeffrey Sachs have been betrayed the principles of academic integrity and openly defending the indefensible. Is defending the genocide, basically. They attempt to minimize the brutal system that the Chinese Communist Party has imposed and to excuse their crimes by referencing the mistakes of the history, rather than using the lessons of history to stand for what's right. They minimize the evil being carried out in the Uyghur homeland. So many have bartered away from freedom pursuit of the Chinese money. When you look at it, Hollywood, the NBA, the mainstream media, and now even our own government officials are silent on this genocide. So our own democracy is at risk from the Chinese Communist Party's expansionist agenda. So as we enter this conversation today, I hope you will remember the context of the emergence of these camps. When the issue of the concentration camps first raised, China basically denied the existence. When the satellite imagery proved the existence, China insisted that they were vocational training schools And this is a complete lie. Detainees include the medical doctors, academics, business people, and professionals, as well as young children and the elderly. None of these people who needs job training. And also China has insisted that they are fighting extremism and told the international community not to interfere in China's so-called internal affairs. The genocide is not internal affairs. The international community has a legal obligation to prevent the genocide. Yet, here we are ignoring the lies and the crimes of the regime. If even the CCP's willingness to deny the world valuable information to fight a pandemic is not enough to us to wake up, what will be? So we must act in defense of the conscience of humanity. And I'm looking forward to the questions and discussion. And thank you again.
Thanks, Rushan. That's a bleak and succinct overview, and we're certainly going to come back to talking about what individuals can do in the face of this crisis. But I want to turn to Sean and Nuri to come back to some of the how and the why questions that Rushan has just surfaced, some of which pertain to lots of different human rights violations across China, indeed, to some extent in other parts of the world. But Sean, some of the people we know, for example, like Dr. Abbas or others who have been arbitrarily detained are, highly skilled professionals. Some of them are people who were in government positions. They've been given government awards or certain kinds of recognitions. How did we get from the situation roughly 10 years ago to where we are now? Maybe you can help fill in that picture a bit for us.
Thank you. I often talk about what's happening as being because of a perfect storm of different factors. On the one hand, what's happening is really about a long, simmering conflict between modern Chinese states and Uyghurs, which has to do with territory that Uyghurs view as their homeland. In this sense, when we talk about genocide, I think the parallels are less with the Holocaust and more with the fate of indigenous peoples like the Native Americans and Australasians and so on. This territory became part of modern China through imperial conquest in the 18th and 18th century, and then in the late 19th century, it really became incorporated into modern China. And that's never really been recognized by the Chinese state, which I think is a critical part of the problems between the Uyghur people and the Chinese state. There's never been kind of a decolonization of the situation. And what I think we've seen over the last 30 years is China's economic expansion and need to develop the land which Uyghurs view as their homeland. And Uyghurs are seen as essentially an obstacle to that goal. However, that's also been accelerated by the global war on terror. Right after 9/11, the Chinese government essentially changed its discourse about Uyghurs from saying that they were a separatist threat, which was going to dissolve the People's Republic of China or its territory, and saying that it was an existential terrorist threat. And in the process, for about a year, the Chinese government really pushed this agenda with the international community and with the different allies who were involved in the global war on terror to identify Uyghurs as part of the enemy in that war. And I think the international community was mostly dismissive, but in 2002, the summer of 2002, as the US was planning its invasion of Iraq, it acquiesced and identified one Uyghur group as a terrorist group. And I think that, recently a government official mentioned this was definitely to get China's cooperation, or not cooperation, but at least acquiescence to the US invasion of Iraq. But he also mentioned that the State Department, in doing that, didn't think this was going to have a serious effect on people. because they didn't really identify this as much of a threat. And I think over the last 20 years, we have definitely seen that that has impacted Uyghurs, because we've seen the government in China go from identifying disloyal Uyghurs, a minority group that they thought was a political threat to the state, to starting to focus on religious Uyghurs as potentially the driving force behind a terrorist threat, and finally identifying the Uyghur people as a whole. And then I think the final part of this, which is critical to understand, is the rise of Xi Jinping in the government in China. Xi Jinping, I think there's two aspects to his rule that are critical to understand in what's happening right now. One is that he has essentially decided that cultural diversity should not be an aspect of the Chinese nation. He's very much a populist nationalist in the mold of several other world leaders right now. And the other aspect is, I think, that he understands that given China's rising profile in the world, they can do this with impunity from the international community. So I think it's the perfect storm of these three different things happening that's essentially resulting in what I consider to be the decimation of these people and their identity.
All right, you and I spend a lot of time talking about, how, not just how we got here, but why this reaction. Human Rights Watch came out earlier this year and accused the Chinese government of committing crimes against humanity. At the same time, the Chinese government is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's the second largest economy in the world, world's largest standing army. Sean, we've watched the campaign of sinicization applied to a number of different communities, with a view towards wiping out those distinct identities and really refashioning them into token identities. But Mary, why is the Chinese government doing what it is doing in the Uyghur region? Why mass arbitrary detentions? Why forced labor? What's the logic there?
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking Perry House for organizing this. This is my second time speaking at this beautiful venue. I'm particularly grateful to Lashuan for organizing this. I'm also grateful for my co-panelists whom I have followed and learned over the years. The question why they're doing it, as Sean pointed out, the official narrative is that they're trying to do this to achieve stability. Stability to the CCP is a paramount concern, and they would do it at any cost. And also at the same time, they also not mentioning something that they were bragging about. Literally 2-3 weeks prior to 9/11, they had a press conference inviting foreign direct investment, and slogan was, Xinjiang is the safest place in China, you should come and invest. And shortly after 9/11, they changed the narrative. Even today, Xi Jinping publicly said that not only because we are in a kind of a corner situation because of the growing concern and condemnation around the world, our narrative is not good enough. Let's project a lovable image of China. So they're still not getting it. That brings us to the point, which is Chinese leadership believe that they can get away with this. And they are proving to be right. We are sadly in year 5 of this genocide. Depending where you start. If you're starting from the time that Chen Jianguo took office, it started in late 2016. If you think of the mass arrest that Sophie's organization documented, it started in summer 2017. Regardless, it's been almost 5 years, but it's still ongoing. And Chinese leaders still to this day think they can get away with it. I think the primary reason from the Uyghur perspective, as someone who was born, raised, and lived through a different period, I do believe that Chinese policies have a strong racist context, as it has been expressed quite comfortably by senior leadership. they call Uyghur ethno-religious identity in a way of people having mental illness, believing in religious life. Spirituality is a sign of thought virus. And what they do, they use this traditional word transformation to take out those who are non-compliant and force those who are not compliant through this re-education program. According to the Chinese government's own admission through this white paper, since 2015, they put 1.3 million Uyghurs annually through the so-called re-education program. So don't listen to the victims, don't listen to the government officials, even the media, just listen to the words coming out of Beijing and Urumqi. It has a strong racist context. Historically, I'm not a historian by training, I'm a lawyer by training, but I read enough. Every time when Chinese state becomes strong, they have done something similar. So this is nothing new. I've seen it myself through my life before coming to the United States. And also, there's something that we cannot forget. This has a lot to do with CCP leadership, or CCP itself, a sense of insecurity. So the Chinese Communist Party, Uyghurs' ethno-national identity, Uyghurs' way of life, Uyghur language, even their look, potentially can cause a political threat. So, and it can be perceived as a sign of disloyalty. Some policy experts often link this to BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Some people sometimes explain the Chinese global ambition through different means. But to me, most important thing, most important reason, of course, they say this is about achieving security, but this has a lot to do with Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, even if Xi Jinping is not power, I do genuinely believe that they would have done something similar.
Yeah, it's a pretty frightening thought when you imagine, extremely powerful governments that don't feel, confined or constrained by things like international law. And as Sean's new book, which is a great read, but it's terribly depressing, about what states think they can get away with. But I mean, Rushan, it would be great, I think, if you could talk about some of your recent work around the issues of companies, because we know that governments are not, or state agencies are not the only actors here. Tell us a little bit about some of those corporate players and how you think they can be made answerable for some of their activities.
Thank you, Sophie. Unfortunately, this genocide the Uyghurs facing today is also powered by the West and the companies, corporations. Most of the big names, brands that we know and that we love and we are using are ties to Uyghur forced labor. This includes companies like Nike, Apple, Coca-Cola, who even lobbied against the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, because the Uyghur homeland produces much of the world's cotton supply. Basically, 1 out of every 5 cotton garments worldwide are tainted by the Uyghur slave labor. This implicates an enormous amount of fashion brands. And the Heinz ketchup, the Uyghur homeland produced massive amount of tomatoes. The Heinz ketchup, which is the family business for Mr. John Kerry's wife, sourced tomatoes from the Uyghur region, basically taking the tears, sweat, and the blood of the Uyghur slaves to picking those tomatoes. With the WRO's the last year, this was addressed, but it demonstrated that a widespread problem that this is. And perhaps one of the most clear examples of disgusting complicity by Western corporations has been demonstrated in the response of the Olympic sponsors. The 2022 Winter Olympics are being held in a land where active genocide is being carried out by the CCP. As I mentioned earlier, we feel like the Chinese government is not only getting away with genocide, but being rewarded, basically. And the International Olympic Committee has ignored repeated calls to move the games. The worst, sponsors like Visa, Coca-Cola, Intel, and the Airbnb, and the Protector and the Gamble, they were called for a congressional hearing just a couple months ago, in which they pitifully defended their company's involvement, and they could not even utter one word against China's human rights abuses and the genocide. I was sitting there watching and appalled. I couldn't believe those are my fellow Americans. Those are the people who's living in this free country, that people have freedom to talk about any kind of social injustice, against any kind of social injustice. And most of these companies have been very active against any kind of social injustice, but they wouldn't even say one single word against the CCP's human rights abuses. So it was absolutely shameful when we have such an environment where our own corporations are terrified to utter a word against the regime. We have already sold away our freedoms, basically.
It was a remarkable hearing in that, as some of you may have observed, Coca-Cola, which is headquartered in Georgia, had taken a very strong position about voting rights and about the voting rights debate there. And it was asked, its representative was asked very similar questions about social justice, about access to power, about exclusion, about discrimination, except in the Uyghur region instead of in Georgia. And boy, that person was desperate to not answer that question. And it was fairly excruciating to watch. But there are a lot of big companies that are still purchasing and manufacturing across the region. And the piece of legislation that Rushan just mentioned is hopefully going to pass the House. But the idea is to take the normal idea of imports into the US, where it's on Customs and Border Patrol to prove that something was made with forced labor. And this piece of legislation flips it around. And the idea is that the company that's importing these products has to show the goods weren't made with forced labor. And it has the potential to really be kind of a transformative model. But Sean, I want to come back to you. I've got one more question for Sean and one for Nuri, and then we're going to open up for questions. So please start thinking of good, tough ones for us. One of the situations that is often invoked as a parallel, roughly anyway, is the Myanmar military's targeting a few years ago of the Rohingya, in which something like 750,000 Rohingya were driven out of northern Myanmar and over the border into Bangladesh. And in those circumstances, the two multilateral bodies that really spearheaded a campaign to protect those people were the European and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, really working together at the UN's Human Rights Council to establish fact-finding mission and take some of the kinds of steps that we would expect to see in the face of this sort of a human rights crisis. Why do you think that hasn't happened?
Well, I think a large part of it is obviously the importance of China's economic investment in various countries. I think that even limits to a degree the amount of pushback we get from the United States government. But certainly, I think we see in the developing world, and not only in the developing world, but throughout the Persian Gulf region, we see Muslim states that have not really reacted to this, and in many instances have actually backed the Chinese government's interpretation that this is an appropriate action against an extremist threat. And I personally can't believe that they're sincere in that response. I think that that is opportunistic. I do think it's also, to a certain degree, we're seeing a moment where various countries around the world feel that they have to kind of line up between China and the United States as we see this kind of geopolitical conflict emerge. And I think countries are reticent to do that. And I think in the Muslim world, there's still a lot of very bad feelings about the United States' actions throughout the global war on terror, which they kind of immediately look at this and say, well, the United States did really bad things under this war as well. So,
yeah, and I think we could probably add the recent disaster of Afghanistan to that
Right.
list, in which, you know, people's rights and particularly women's rights have just been sort of thrown to the wind, as some of my current colleagues would have it. So one of the first questions that's come in online actually dovetails, Nuri, with the question I was going to put to you, but I think I might actually ask each of you to weigh in on this. The question is, what can we do? You know, we're obviously, the four of us are not the EU or the OIC. You know, we're lawyers and activists and scholars. But Nuri, what do you think that people can best do to support the community, either inside or outside the region?
That's a great question. I think we've been talking about the bad actors, bad intentions coming from China enough. And I think it's the general public who can read and could conduct basic research can find out the events unfolding in China, not only against Uyghurs, but Xi Jinping's fellow Han Chinese citizens. So we have this regime in Beijing and doing this domestically and globally. So the first thing that the American public need to do is to recognize that this is not a typical human rights violation. This is about us. This is on us now, because we have a power to change through consumer activism, through pressuring the members of Congress, through the election process in our country, through events like this to educate a general public. Why I think this is important for you to understand this is our problem now, because you are part of the problem. I am sorry for being blunt. The clothes that you're wearing, the beauty products that they're using, and some of you even wearing the PPE masks that are reportedly produced by enslaved Uyghurs. So when our government and environmental activists telling the world that we need to start a green revolution, putting solar panels on our rooftop, I would be one of the first people to do it. But at the same time, you have to remember that those solar panels are made by modern slaves. When you go to Costco, when you go to the brand name stores to buy your next cotton t-shirt, the chances of that t-shirt being made by enslaved Uyghurs are great. And also when you buy the next electronics, the remote control, or the equipment in Amazon, or electronic components, the chance of that being made by the Uyghurs, or even sneakers that we wear. And also it is our responsibility under our government's or country's treaty and legal obligation. The United States government's calling out as a genocide is just a policy response. It's not a legal response. It is just a decision to call it what it is. But the real thing follows, what do you do about it? The genocide determination, crimes against humanity determination was announced on January 20th. We're almost marking a year, but we have not really heard from our government if they have a plan, if they have a policy. Where are you going to do it? What is it that you're planning to do? We don't have a specific human rights agenda from either previous government or the current government. So we need to use your power to engage in consumer activism and citizen activism Stop buying products made in China. If you believe that product is linked to enslaved Uyghurs, a fellow human being. And also get on the phone, call the White House and ask them, do you have a plan? We've been hearing about this Uyghur genocide so long. We were told through our education, never again, but never again is happening again right now in China. What are you going to do about it? And call your members, congressman, senator, tell them to pass this Human Rights Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That is a very significant bill. That bill will address some of the most pressing issues. To get the Chinese attention, you got to do two things. One, publicly condemn their behavior. As I said, they feel and they've proven to be right that they can get away with it. We're still dancing around. Sophie always said, can you imagine any country locks up 1 million of their Muslim citizens? What kind of reaction that you would get? It's not difficult to predict. And also, the other thing that the Chinese will take you very seriously if you increase the cost economically for their crimes being committed on the daylight. So your help is extremely helpful. Events like this, you can educate public and also use your democratic rights. Pressure the members of Congress. They need to act on the anti-Uyghur slavery bill.
Terrific. Sean, do you want to make a quick addition to that? And then in a minute, we're going to come to the floor here. If people want to line up at the mic, if you've got questions, we'll come to you in just a sec. Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I've made the argument several times that consumer advocacy is really important here, because I personally don't trust states to do the right thing in this context because of our present global economy is so interconnected. We're seeing this already from, I think maybe last year, the year before, we started to see US companies start to divest. And now we're slowly seeing them find loopholes to get back in to the Uyghur region or to other factories where there is Uyghur coerced labor working. So I feel that it's really important to have a grassroots movement on the par with the anti-apartheid movement that happened in the 80s. I do think that that kind of pressure eventually will turn important people in Beijing against these policies when they see that it's not in their best interest.
Okay, great. Rishan, any last thoughts from you about what people can do?
Yeah, Nuri and Sean both put great ideas forward, and only a couple other points I want to say is contact your elected officials to carry out a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics as a bare minimum, and also follow work of Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor and the Berlin-Beijing campaign, that Campaign for Uyghurs, and a few other organizations started, and follow our work on a social media, and also go to our website, campaignforuyghurs.org, to sign up for our mailing list, so you can keep yourself updated with the information and share the information with your families, friends, and community. And also advocating on university campuses to follow the Harvard's example of moving Chinese programs to Taiwan. And you can also donate to our organization, Campaign for Uyghurs, so we can continue our advocacy work of ending the Uyghur genocide. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
And let me just add one thing that Raf Shan's comment just reminded me of. At universities, there happens to be endowments, and looking at those endowments, that's what a lot of people did in the 80s with South African companies, is looking how much is invested. And I know my alma mater, there was a big article in the New York Times that it has a very successful endowment because they smartly invested in tech industries in China. And I can guarantee a lot of those tech industries were involved in the surveillance of Uyghurs that has led to the present moment.
Right. Great. If people are interested in coming up to the mic, we'll take one question from online first that says, the United States is set to rejoin the UN Human Rights Council this Thursday. Can the US oppose China's human rights abuses through UN fora? And if so, how? Who wants to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay.
The United States leadership in international forums is extremely important. Withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council was a mistake, and we please and welcome the decision to rejoin. But warming that seat is not enough. The US need to show leadership.
Just a little louder.
Oh, you
Nora.
A
can-
little louder, yeah.
So the rejoining the Human Rights Council is a good decision. It's long overdue, but just showing up at meetings and possessing a seat is not enough. The leadership is what is lacking. If the US does not take up the leadership in coordination with allies and partners, China will do it and has done it. So we need to understand that sky does not fall on you when you take a tougher stance on human rights. As part of the UN system, the United States has a legal obligation, treaty obligation. I cannot emphasize enough of that obligation that the United States need to fulfill. And also, the United States should also organize global a partnership specifically on the Uyghur issue. I recently wrote an essay and recommended something called Friends of Uyghurs Summit, because at the end of the day, if the US alone cannot do this, and this has to be coordinated and collaborated effort. If you look at the export volume, for example, on forced labor products, Italy remained to be the largest destination as we speak. And European governments still has not really figured it out. At least in the United States, we have imposed global sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act and added more than 90 punitive sanctions have been announced. But this takes time, and also this requires a global coordinated effort, and UN would be a perfect place to do it.
Great, thanks. We have a question from the gentleman over here. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for being here. So my question is simple, if a little bit grim. Suppose that the international community continues to do nothing. What does the Uyghur region look like in 20 years?
Rushan, do you want to try to answer that? Do you need me to repeat it? Or could
Yeah,
you?
if you can. I think I got it, but the last part I couldn't hear very clearly. So if, go ahead.
Suppose the international community continues to do nothing. What does the Uyghur region look like in 20 years?
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very important question. With the current forced sterilizations, forced abortions, and also the Uyghur girls, Uyghur women forced to marry Han Chinese men, and the Uyghur children are taken from their families and taken to state-run orphanages. If this continues another 20 years, there's not going to be any more Uyghurs. So this is a modern day, modernized genocide. They're not going to have gas chambers or mass killings, but eventually the way that they are calculating and the taking actions of each step of the genocide and the implementing against the Uyghurs, there's not going to be any more Uyghurs. If you look at the 10 stages of the genocide, at the end, the point is denial, denying the genocide, repeatedly denying the genocide. Currently, there's a Uyghur tribunal going on in UK. First one was back in June, and the second one was in September, middle of September. And the Julia Millsap was among you today. She and my husband, Abdul Hakim Idris, they both testified. Today, we have the foreign ministry, Chinese foreign ministry's spokesperson publicly attacking my husband with his picture and his name, and calling some other people who testified. They listed like 6-7 people who testified at the Uyghur Tribunal, calling them all liars and denying everything that they have done. So at the state level, officially, they are spreading libel and also demonizing the Uyghur people. And it was the Darren Byler and the Teng Biao, one of the Chinese activists. So basically, they are to the point now. They are successfully conducting this genocide, and the international community is not doing anything. And if this continues, again, I cannot emphasize enough that Uyghurs will be exterminated.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll just add one quick thought on the question about the United Nations Human Rights Council. It's a few technicalities. The elections are this week. The US won't, and the other successful candidates won't actually rejoin until the beginning of next year. But again, I mean, backing up to the parallel of, what would happen if we saw other governments committing violations of this scope and scale? What my organization typically argues for is an investigation under the auspices of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that then makes recommendations about whether there is criminal liability to then refer those findings to a court, for example. And it's amazing how slow and painstaking the progress towards that discussion has actually been, even just in trying to get an investigation up and running. We are hopeful that now that the High Commissioner for Human Rights has committed to actually sharing some kind of a report about the current situation, that will help catalyze some more diplomatic momentum. Now, like Sean, I am skeptical about governments and their agendas and their willingness and ability to really follow through. But I think the idea that no state is above the law is an animating one. And it's interesting to me, at least, that, for example, one of the governments that was quite supportive of the establishment of a commission of inquiry on systemic global racism and police violence, which was largely directed towards the United States, and which I want to be very clear, Human Rights Watch supports, was the Chinese government. So it was willing to back the establishment of a UN investigation into systemic racism and police violence here, but not to accept a similar or sort of a roughly comparable investigation in the Uyghur region. And I think it's interesting that as the Chinese government becomes a much more sophisticated player at an institution like the Human Rights Council, that there is, I think, a commensurately greater need to see that it, like any other major world power, is also held accountable. And if there is an idea that I think animates diplomats and government officials, whether they're looking at human rights issues, whether they're looking at trade, whether they're looking at issues like the South China Seas, it's the idea of an established set of black letter international laws being systematically violated by a particular powerful actor, and sort of rejuvenating the idea that those established rules matter. It's not a small diplomatic lift to imagine, as we've seen in some other cases, that a successful investigation takes place, that there's a referral to a competent legal authority that already exists, as opposed to having to create a whole new one, since China is not a state party to some of the judicial mechanisms to which some of these kinds of cases would normally be referred. And what the ultimate outcome could be. And one of the suggestions that Human Rights Watch has made, some of you may be aware that some Syrians were recently prosecuted in Germany for abuses they committed in Syria. And this was done under a legal concept called universal jurisdiction. And on paper, at least, most democracies respect this idea that people can be pursued for crimes committed elsewhere in other countries. And I think there's some room to explore that idea for some of the government officials who are responsible for serious human rights crimes in the region. We've probably got time for maybe one more question. I'm just going to check the WhatsApp feed here to see if there is one. But if yes, no, we don't have one there. So actually, I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative, which is just to ask quickly each of you, if there is a message that you would want people across the region to hear from this conversation this afternoon, anything you wanted, what would you want that to be? Sean, I'll start with you.
I guess, one of the things that concerns me is that there's a lot of fear that we're entering into an age of a new Cold War between the US and China. And a lot of people, therefore, do not want to get involved in this issue, which they feel could actually fuel that, right? But, going back to what Sophia was talking about, the UN, I see things very differently. I see that the US hegemony in the world is declining. But I don't think we're moving towards an era of a new hegemon. I think it's time that states in the world have to actually get together and negotiate what are the rules of the game, and try to really enforce a situation where no state is above the rules. That's a high order to get accomplished, but I think that that's where we're headed. And this issue, I feel, is a crux issue in seeing how the international community as a whole is going to deal with mass atrocities.
Great. Actually, Nuri Rushan, I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball because we do have another actually set of questions that have come in. So Nuri, for you first, if you could follow up on the idea of modern genocide, meaning as I think distinct from the 30s and the 40s, and the role of gender, especially sexual violence and forced marriage, why are these elements of genocide?
It's under the Genocide Convention, Article 2, at least 2 of those legal requirements are met in the Uyghur genocide, separation of Uyghur children and violence against the Uyghur woman through sterilization. But the real question is, this is a different type of genocide that people should be reminded of. Sean was right in saying that this is not a Holocaust, and we should not mix it up with the Holocaust. It's different. Here's why. The Chinese are using very sophisticated techniques, may have even found a loophole in the legal arena. They're also trying to normalize their behaviors. Not only they have been successful, they're also promoting what appeared to be working method to other countries. Late in 2018, Chinese state media were publicly bragging about their ability to tackle the world's Muslim problem. In other words, the West is bombing your cities, killing your people, whereas we, People's Republic of China, have been successful domestically. We take care of the Muslim problem, but also we can teach you a few things about how to deal with your own population. Late last year, based on a witness testimony in a hearing that I presided, one of the witnesses told us that there are more than 80 countries around the world already adopted Chinese surveillance technology to squelch public resentment for human rights, used for human rights abuses, religious persecution. So this is becoming a new norm. So the Chinese digital authoritarianism should give you a chill. And if this does not wake you up, this new normalization being promoted, developed, tested, and promoted around the world by PRC, I don't know what kind of future do you want for yourself, for your children, for the next generation? Yes, we do care about climate change, but that should not be at the expense of the Uyghurs. Yeah, we like modern technology, but what kind of modern technology? Are we allowing that to be intrusive as it has been? Are we allowing it to be the threat to democratic principles, human rights, religious freedom, civil liberties? That's the question for you to address. So again, this is not a typical human rights issue that you feel remote or distant, or unrelated to. This is about us. So it's incumbent upon you to do something about this.
Then Rushan, just to bring it back to you, I mean, these kinds of forced marriage and sexual violence, what does this achieve? And are there other kinds of policies or aspects of this crisis that, from your perspective, are particularly gendered?
Yes, absolutely, Sophie. When I talk about this genocide, I always say this is unprecedented atrocity of this century. Nowhere in the world and no time in the history something like this has happened. Chinese media itself stated that they reported 1.1 million Han Chinese cadres, mostly men. They deployed to Uyghur homes. Most of the Uyghur men are taken to concentration camps or prisons or sent to forced labor facilities. So the Uyghur women at home, they are facing sexual abuse in their own house, in their own bedroom, and they cannot refuse. If they say no, then they will send to the concentration camps, because these Chinese cadres coming in and living inside of their houses, they're supposed to monitor and to supervise their daily lives and give them credit score. And also, when I mentioned earlier the forced marriages of the Uyghur women, if the Uyghur women say no to such a forced marriage, which is being basically sponsored by the government, because Chinese government is giving money, housing, and the jobs for Han Chinese men to marry Uyghur women. If the Uyghur girls refuse such a forced marriage, they will send to concentration camps as Islamic extremists or radicalized Muslim did not want to marry non-Muslim atheist Han Chinese. So this is actually very much gender-based, abusing of the Uyghur women. I call this government-sponsored mass rape of the Uyghur women.
Sean, thank you. I know it's so late for you, and we really appreciate your being here. Sean, Nuri, I also want to thank all the members of the student body here who are concerned about the Uyghur situation, to LaShawn, to Jared, to Andrea, to everybody at Perry World House who's made this discussion possible. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We'll wrap it up there.
I shouldn't really be following this kind of extraordinary panel. Can you all hear me? Is the mic on? Yeah? Hope you can hear me online. So I have some remarks to make, but before I make the remarks, I actually want to make sure we give our panelists a warm round of applause.
Well, thank all of you.
Hard to actually applaud in this situation, because what are we actually applauding? We're applauding that people are actually dedicating their lives to keeping us honest. Sorry, apparently you can't hear me. So there are a lot of takeaways from this, and you'll be able to view this online. But I think one of the important messages here is that your choices matter, right? That your consumer choices matter. That who you put in office actually really matters. That big multilateral institutions, I need to be shorter, actually matter. And that there are solutions. They won't be easy solutions, given China's might in the world and given the world's preoccupation with lots of other problems. But when we say never again, like, do we really mean it? Because there's several genocides since never again. So one of the things I hope you'll take away is your own personal power. I think that in a world with vast problems, we wonder what we can do, but we've actually been given lots of opportunities to do something. And so our panelists will be here for a few minutes afterwards for those of you who are in the live audience, and you might be able to talk with them. So I want to thank you again for an extraordinary conversation. One that I think leaves us a little bit hopeful too. At a minimum, we know that obviously calling this genocide is not enough. There's a big rah, rah, rah about that. It's just a genocide. Indisputable. Indisputable. We can move on from that. And then you ask yourself what it is that we need to do. So we hope that you'll be back soon. And for those of you on campus, you can look online and you'll see that we have a week of opportunities next week to talk about careers in the global sphere, where you can come to Perry World House every day between noon and 1:15 and learn about careers during our Global Career Week, and human rights and international development, international internships, foreign policy and national security, and international fellowships and graduate opportunities. Also stay tuned for the next The World Today, which will be on October 26th, featuring retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, the former Director for European Affairs for the United States National Security Council, discussing his new book, Here, Rights Matter. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel and can find out all about our other upcoming events by joining our mailing list and following us on social media. We'll drop links in the chat for that. So until next time, be well, be safe, and thanks again for coming. Goodbye.